Having an amazing day so far. All right, so for today, we will be doing our grade 1 lesson, a grade 1 English lesson on verb tenses. And before we start our lesson, we are going to log into aplusstudents.ca and we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password. Once we've logged in with our username as well as our password, and then we are going to select the subject of language arts. And then grade 1. All right, so once we've selected grade 1, and then we are going to scroll down up until we get to the chapter of verb tenses. All right, so once we get to the chapter of verb tenses, so we said the chapter is verb tense. Our subject is English language arts, grade 1. And the lessons that we will be focusing on today under the chapter of verb tense is to select the sentence that tells you about the present, select the sentence that tells us about the past, and to select the sentence that tells us about the future. So that is going to be our 3 focus lessons under the chapter of verb tenses. And our tutorial lesson we are doing on aplusstudents.ca. And that is where we are doing all of our lessons as well as our test after every lesson. Before we end the class, we are going to read a story, right? Which is Pick a Pumpkin, and that is going to be on aplusclasses.ca. But that will be close to the end of our lesson. Then we will log on to aplusclasses.ca. We'll go down to reading, and our story that we will be focusing on is Pick a Pumpkin. All right, so that is going to be our focus lessons, our chapter subject, as well as the grade for our lesson and our session today. All right, so when it comes to verb tenses, right? So verb tense, it refers to when the action in a sentence takes place, right? So a verb, right? It's a doing word. It's action that takes place, right? In any sentence. And within a completed sentence, there's always a verb. There's always something happening, right? So even if you are on the other side of the screen, you are listening, right? That is the action that you are doing. I am talking, right? That's the action that I'm doing, right? But now when it comes to verb tenses, right, it refers to the action in the sentence take place. So when the action in the sentence take place. And thus the action, it can either happen in the past, right? Meaning it happened already, or it will happen in the future, meaning that it will happen, right? It did not happen yet, it will happen. And we can have it an action taking place in the present, right? Meaning it is happening now. So the present, if we are thinking of an example now of something happening now in the present, and then we can basically say that it's either you are watching or you are listening, I am talking, right? Um, if you are typing, then you are typing, right? That is something that you are doing now, right? And I am basically just talking or teaching, right? Or, yeah, it's something that I'm doing and something that you are also doing. So that is something that is happening now, and now is in the present. And like we said, in the past, it is something that happened already, right? It happened already. All right, so if we break down our verb tenses, right? Our different verb tenses. So verbs, right? It tells something that is happening now, right? And I made an example where I said that you are listening now, or you are looking at your screen now, or you're watching your screen now, or if you are typing, then you are typing, right? If you are talking to someone, then you are talking to someone now. And I can also say that I am either talking or I'm teaching, right? That is something that is happening now. So some verbs, they tell about something that is happening now, and we call that the present, right? So these verbs tells about the present. So they are basically happening now. And when it comes to, see, and they usually have no ending, right? So if you said it's happening now, it is no ending to something that is happening now, right? It is ongoing. So when it comes to the verbs that tell us about the present, right? They end in s, right? So they usually have either no ending or they end in s. So we can either say, let me get a, let me just do this, scroll that a bit down. So we can then either say that she listens to her teacher, right? So that means that this person is listening, right? Listens to her teacher, right? Or he talks to his friends, right? So that is two examples of verbs, right? Or verb tenses that is happening or that is telling us about the present, right? And before I continue to explain the verb tenses that is happening in the past as well as the future, we are going to the tutorial, and we're going to a+students.ca, and we are first going to do the lesson on to select the sentence that tells us about the present. All right, so some verbs, they tell us about something that has happened, right? And these verbs tell us about the past. So we are not going to focus on the past now, we are just going to focus on the present, right? So with the present, we say that some verbs, they tell us about something that is happening now, right? And we made a few examples of verbs or something that is happening now, right? where you listen. Um, I talk, for example, right? And these verbs, they tell us about the present. It's happening now, right? So they usually have no ending or they end in S. And in two examples, right? If we look at an example of verbs or the tense within the present, you can say, we walk to school today, right? We walk to school today. Or the parade starts now, right? The parade starts now. We can even say things like the students listens to their teacher, right? So that can also be a it can be a verb that tells us about the present. And then we also have some that is about the future, and that is also what we are going to find out more um, later on within our. All right. So which sentence tells us about the present, right? So we are going to first figure out about the present, right? It says, I love warm nights, right? Or dad and mom hugged us before bed, right? So if we look at both of these sentences, I love warm nights, then the very first sentence, which is I love warm nights, it is something that you love, right? So you love warm nights. And the verb have, it has no ending, right? It tells us about something that is happening right now. So we'll assume that it's a very warm night. So this person is saying that they love warm nights, specifically referring to an warm night, for example, like tonight, right? So this basically tells us about the present. And this means that it is something that is happening right now, right? It's happening right now. Before we go on to the next sentence, right? I think we're gonna just have to go over the past as well as the future. So some verbs, right, they also tell us about something that happened already, right? Or that has happened already. And these verbs, they tell us about the past. So anything that happened already or has already happened, we say that these verbs, they tell us about the past, right? Meaning it happened already. And if something happened already, then our verb, right, it needs to end in ed, right? So the verb will end in ed. For example, we walked, there's walked to the store yesterday. It is something that already, right? So yesterday, remember yesterday is in the past, right? So anything that happened yesterday, that happened 2 days ago, that happened last year, that happened last month, it's things that happened in the past, right? And we can then say that these words or the verbs, they end in ed, right? And then the show started last week. So started, right? So started is our verb, right? That refers to something that happened already, right? It's a verb that tells us about the past. So it tells us about the past and it happened already. And then we already mentioned the present, right? And then some verbs they tell us about something that happened, going to happen. So some verbs they tell us about something that is going to happen. It is going to happen. It did not happen yet. Right? So if something didn't happen yet, then it means that it is going to happen. It's like we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, so we can then say that it is going to happen. So if you want to make mention of anything that is going to happen tomorrow or next week, and then you can say that it is going to happen, and we refer to that as being the verb that tells us about the future, right? So the future, it is something that is going to happen. When we make mention of something that is going to happen, then in a sentence we usually say, we use the word it will happen, right? I will walk to the park next week. The party will start soon, right? So that is verbs that tells us about the future. Will. All right. If we look at these two sentences, the one says grandpa baby, and the other one says he patted his puppy's head. If we look at both of these sentences, right? Grandpa holds the baby, holds the baby. So the verb holds that ends in S, it gives us the indication that it is happening now, which means that it tells us about the present. It's happening now. Grandpa holds the baby. So we don't have to say grandpa is holding the baby now. We can just say grandpa holds the baby. And remember, we said that with the present, it's either ongoing, the verb is ongoing, or we add an S, right? And there we add an S to hold, holds the baby. And this is something that is happening now, and it tells us about the present. And if we look at the other sentence that says, he patted his puppy's head, right? So the verb patted, patted. Remember we said that if something that happened in the past, right? If we want to make mention of something that happened in the past, and then we add ed. So the past happened already. If something happened already, then we add an ed to our verb. So he patted his puppy's head. So he could have patted his puppy's head this morning, yesterday, right? Few hours ago, last month, last week, right? He patted his puppy's head. And this tells us about the past, meaning it happened already. All right, and if we look at these two sentences, right? It says dad swims in the pool and Phil washed his cup. We need to say which one tells us about the present. And what did we say is the present? The present tells us about something that is happening now. The present. So is it dad swims in the pool or Phil washed his cup? So dad swims in the pool or Phil washed his cup. So if we need to say which one tells us about the present, and then we're going to say it is dad swims in the pool. And remember we said that if we add an S to our verb, right? It shows the action that is ongoing, but it tells us about something that is happening right now, and that is the present. All right, so now we're going to do a test, right? Where we are going to basically select the sentence that tells us about the present. So we need to say which sentence tells about the present, right? Something that is happening now. That is the present. It is happening now. All right. There are four different options, right? It says she thinks about her trip all the time. We will paint our room blue. We were going to go to the pool, or I washed the dishes. So we need to choose the correct sentence that tells us about the present. It tells us about something that is happening now. Action that is taking place now. All right, so if we select the sentence that tells us about the, and then we can say she thinks about her trip all the time. And that word thinks, right, where the S is also, it shows ongoing, right? Thing that she's doing now. She thinks about her trip all the time. So we need to still say which sentence tells about the present. I will walk to the zoo. I live in that yellow house. He walked the dog. Robin will joining us. We need to say which sentence tells us about the present. And if we choose the correct one, then we can say, I live in that yellow house, meaning that you are living there now, right? Not I will be living there, which can be any time tomorrow, next week, next month, right? Not I lived in the house, meaning that it's in the past. No, now the present, it means that you live in that yellow house. So that is the present. Something that is happening now. And which sentence tells us about the present? Liz and her friends jump high. I will talk to Nina. She lived in Paris. They watched that movie at the cinema. So we need to choose one of these sentences that tells us about the present, that tells us about something that is happening now. All right, so if we choose the sentence that tells us about something that is happening in the present, which is happening now, then we can say Liz and her friends jump high, right? And that is our sentences that tells us about the present. Now we're going on to the past, right? And we said some verbs that tells us about something that has happened, that has already, right? So things that has already happened, and we call these verbs that tells us about the past. So these verbs that tell us about the past, it's things that has already happened. And the verbs that tells us about the past, right? They usually end in ed. So you need to add an ed to your verb. So meaning if we were to mention this same sentence within the present, then we can say we walk to the store, right? So we walk to the store, something that you're doing now. And in the past, right, we can say we walked to the store yesterday, right? And in the future, we can say we will walk to the store, right? So there's basically an example that is in the present, in the past, as well as in the future, right? And remember, we said that the verb tenses, right? It either tells us about something that happened in the present, that happened in the past, or that will happen in the future, right? So if we also look, we specifically went over the present also. Remember, we said the present, it tells us about something that is happening now, right? And they either end in S. The verb ends in S. And if we make mention of something that is going to happen, then we say these verbs that tell us about the future, right? Because they we use words like will. So in the future, it's things that will happen, right? It still has to happen. All right. If we look at these two sentences, right? First one being they walked to the park and he will put ice in the water. If you look at that two sentences, right? We need to say which one tells us about the past. Remember, we said that our verb that tells us about the past, it ends in ed. And the verb is the action that takes place within that sentence, which means that we will then say the first one, meaning they walked to the park, right? So the verb walked, it ended in ed. And that tells us about something that happened already, or it already happened. That is in the past. Dusty wagged his tail. Wagged his tail. And she shows us her new bike. She shows us her new bike. If we look at that two sentence, which one tells us about the past? If we look at both of those sentences, which one tells us about the past? And remember, we said that our verb, it ends in ed if it tells us about the past. All right, so which means that we will say Dusty wagged his tail. wagged his tail. And wagged, it ends in ed, and it tells us about something that already happened, and that tells us about the past. All right, so now we're going to do our test, right? Where we are going to select the sentence that tells us about the past. So, which sentence tells us about the past? We're going to have to choose one of these four options that tells us about the past. And remember, our verb, right? The action that is taking place within that sentence, that word, right? It needs to end in ed. So the party just started. We will work very hard. The dog is barking. Or grandma will make the cake. We need to choose one of these four sentences that tells us about the past. It tells us about something that happened already. And if we choose the correct one, we can say the party just started, right? Started. And that tells us about the past. It started and it ends with an ed. Ride their bikes to the store. We laughed at the silly picture. He will walk to the party, and Grandma is making dinner now. We need to choose the correct one that tells us about the past. Tells us about something that already happened. All right, so if we choose the sentence that tells us about the past, then we will say we laughed at the silly picture. Laughed, and it ends in ed. Our verb, laughed at the silly picture. I hear people at the door. She loved my song about animals. Grandpa is fishing. We will take the dog to the vet tomorrow. We need to choose the correct sentence that tells us about the past, that tells us about something that already happened. And if we choose a sentence that tells us about something that already happened, and then we will say, she loved my song about animals. Loved, and it ends in ed. All right, so far we selected the sentence that tells us about the present that is happening now, and that tells us about the past that happened already. So now we are going to figure out or learn about the sentences that tells us about the future, and some verbs that tell us about something that is going to happen, right? Did not happen yet, can either happen tonight, can happen tomorrow morning, can happen next week, next month, next year, right? So they will tell us about something that is going to happen. And these verbs, they tell us about future. And we use the words will in sentence, right? For example, We will walk to the park next week, meaning that you did not walk yet because it's not next week yet, right? So we will walk to the park next week. And the party will start soon. So will, it gives us an indication that it is happening in the future or it is going to happen in the future. And if we look at these sentences, I will thank Phil for the food, or Greg sees a bird near his window. We need to say which one of these two sentences is the future. It's telling us about something that will happen. All right, so if we look at the sentence that is telling us about the future, and then we can say it is I will thankful for the food, right? So will is the indication that it is something that is telling us that it's going to happen, and it tells us about the future. So the word will in there will happen. Did not happen yet, it will happen. The puppy will sleep on the mat, or the girl plays in the grass. So the puppy will sleep on the mat, or the girl plays in the grass. All right, so choose the correct one sentence that tells us about the future, and then we can say the puppy will sleep on the mat, right? And this tells us about something that is going to happen. Will, right? If something did not happen yet, we put the word will in front of our verb. Now we're going to say which sentence tells us about the future, right? It is something that will happen. It hasn't happened yet. Tape the pink box. We will eat outside. Jane ate the last piece of cake. Jack is swimming with him. We need to say which sentence tells us about the future. All right, and this tells us about the future. We can then say we will eat outside, right? So that can either be later, it can be tomorrow, it can be next week, but we will eat outside. We will watch Nina's game. Dad laughs with his sister. Jane made dinner for us last week. Or Mike eats his croissant. We need to say which sentence tells us about the future. Something that will happen. And then we can say it is the first one. We will watch Nina's game. All right. So far these are verb tenses, right? And we we basically had to select the sentences that tells us about the present, about the past that happened already. The present is something that is happening now, and the future it is something that will happen. It hasn't happened yet, right? So now if we look at these sentences over here, right? He talked on the phone, right? If we write that sentence in the present, right? So we can either say he talked on the phone, Or we can say in the present, he talks on the phone, right? And that basically shows the present, right? So he talks on the phone, and that shows the present. It is something that is doing now. If we were to write that very same sentence, he talks on the phone. If we had to write that very same sentence in the past, right? Remember we said that in the past we add an ed. So if we had to write that sentence in the past, and then we can say, he talked on the phone. So talked, and there it ends in an ed, right? And this shows the past. And if we look at that very same sentence, right, and we write that in the future, and then we can say, he will talk on the phone. He will talk on the phone. And the word will, it gives us an indication that this is in the future, right? So there we basically use one sentence that basically, and we basically show that it can be used in the present, how it is used in the past, and how it can be used within the future. And these are different tenses, verb tenses. All right, so before we end our lesson, right, let's go to a plus classes.ca. So a plus classes.ca. We're going to learning materials. We're going to select grade 1, reading, and we're going to scroll down all the way up until we get the 4 boxes, beautiful purple boxes. Then we're going to select the third box that says read along audiobooks level 1. And we're going to click on start. And the book that we are going to be reading aloud is Pick a Pumpkin.
Pick a Pumpkin by First 100 Institute. Pick a Pumpkin by First 100 Institute. It is fun to go to the pumpkin patch. Which pumpkin will you pick? Will you choose a tall or a short pumpkin? How about picking a bumpy pumpkin? Will you choose a green or an orange pumpkin? How about picking a pumpkin with a long, twisty stem? Will you choose a giant or a tiny pumpkin? Maybe the pumpkin you pick will be different from all the others. There are so many pumpkins, it is hard to choose. But somewhere in the pumpkin patch, there is a pumpkin waiting just for you.
All right. So that is basically our reading or our story, Pick a Pumpkin. And especially now that it's in certain parts of the country, people are celebrating Halloween, right? So they are definitely going to be needing to pick pumpkins and cut out and decorate the pumpkins, right? And go and do trick or treat, right? All right, so that is now the end of our lessons, grade one on verb tenses. And we spoke about the verb tenses that tells us about the present, something that is happening now, about the past that happened already, or about the future, something that will happen and it did not happen yet. So thank you very much, grade ones, for listening. Thank you for interacting. Thank you for being part of the class. You should have a good day further. Goodbye.